I think this is the most beautiful room I have ever given a talk in, and the coziest. So I'm very happy to be here. I thought I would share a little bit of my journey, where I come from and how I got here, my mission, what it is I'm trying to do, and then talk about 3x5 for climate. So basically, 3 things we need to link to solve the climate crisis. That's facts, feelings, and action. And 5-ish things under each of them that we can keep in mind or that we need to focus on to actually fix the climate crisis. Sound good? All right, that's what I'll do. So just by way of background, I come from a small town in Northern California, about an hour north of San Francisco, named Sonoma. And it's the wine country. So I grew up in a family that owned some vineyards. I studied the impacts of climate change on the wine industry for my PhD. And I did that because I was interested in linking this, at the time, seemingly very abstract and far away idea of climate change with a place and a thing that I loved and cared about. For me and my family, wine was something we grew up with on the dinner table. It's actually a way that you can taste climate change. And I think one of the first sort of experiences I had of personally experiencing climate change, not as a graph that I produced or that I learned about in grad school, not as something that would happen in the distant future to other people and in other places, but something that was actually happening here and now to me, was tasting the changing taste of wine. This was in the 2000s. I was studying wine at University of California, Davis, and doing my PhD at Stanford, and trying to understand what the impacts of climate change were on wine growing at that time, and what wine growers could do to adapt to climate change, and also the limits to adaptation. So we now know there's quite a lot that people can do to cope with the impacts of climate change, but we also know there are limits to how far that can go and be successful. So that was what I was studying at the time. I think what made me, still it felt like climate change was important. I knew it was urgent, but it became more sort of central to my mission when I got the chance to be at the Paris Agreement. So I was an observer for Lund University at the United Nations process in Paris in 2015. I actually got to sit in the front row of the observers in the back where the Paris Agreement was adopted. And I actually get chills even thinking about it, that remembering the tremor in the voice of the translator who was translating for the French diplomatic team that was leading the conference, many of the speakers, it felt like, the eyes of the world were on the people in that room, and they actually rose to the occasion. And I felt then and there like, this is something that I have to make my mission and carry forward. Okay, the world has agreed through this heroic democratic process. We're going to limit the harmful impacts of climate change. We're actually going to stop global warming in my lifetime. So what can I do to make that a reality? It's been up and down since then. There has been a lot of progress. One thing that is helpful to reflect on, so in the lead up to 2015, the Paris Agreement, at that time, the best scientific projections were that the world was heading for something like 4 degrees of global warming under business as usual. And that is a really catastrophe, terrible scenario. That means total devastation and a fundamentally unrecognizable planet. So that is very bad news. The news has gotten a lot better since 2015. We're not where we need to be. We need to go faster and further. But it's about half of the way, it's about half as bad, basically. Closer to 2 degrees of warming is what business as usual is headed for. Depends exactly how you count and how much you believe that existing promises will in fact be reached, but the curve is actually being bent. So that is good news, and we've seen that progress happen in the last few years. And I just had a chance before this to meet with a group of teenagers, which was really inspiring and super thoughtful, engaging people. And they said, it feels like nothing is happening in my lifetime. So I think it can be hard to see when things are actually happening under our feet. That said, things are not happening fast enough. And I think for many of us, the climate crisis is coming home to reach us personally. For me, I think the most vivid example was in 2017, when first my parents, then my sister, and basically everyone I know in my hometown was evacuated from their homes because of catastrophic wildfires. And it feels really different to be researching climate change, looking at impacts, watching vegetation change on mountain landscapes, which is the first research I did in climate. So how warming was chasing species up a mountain who were trying to maintain their niche. Looking at how the color and chemical compounds in wine were changing, wine grapes were changing and changing the taste of wine. That's really different than getting a call, well, first a text from my mom with a picture of a wildfire coming up their hill. And then this lack of urgency or concern that she was expressing, whereas I had this cold sweat of, okay, you need to get out. And I know that now, thankfully, my family was safe. Their homes were also safe. There were about 5,000 people in that fire who were not as lucky, who lost their homes, and 50 plus who lost their lives. So this has really, when we know that those fires in California, for example, in the West and the US, fires have become twice as large and destructive due to human-caused climate change. And the days of high fire risk in the fall, which is when this fire happened, have doubled due to human-caused climate change. So many more people are having these kind of experiences where, really the most important people and things to us are being threatened. And you shared this with me. I hope it's okay to mention that your daughter was evacuated, or you told your daughter, who called you from Greece this summer, oh, Mom, there's a fire nearby, there's ash falling on us on the beach, and you said, put on your trainers, pack a small bag, and get out. And more of us are having those experiences in climate change. So the threat is much closer, and the badness of it's bad has become much more close to hand. So I guess to put what I'm trying to do, my mission is to keep carbon out of the atmosphere. Carbon is the main greenhouse gas. That's the majority of our problems are caused by about 75% of climate pollution is burning fossil fuels, so coal, oil, and gas. And about the remaining quarter is how we treat nature. So cutting down forests and raising animals and how we treat soil for agriculture. So basically the shift I'm trying to make happen is leaving fossil fuels in the ground, making a fast and fair transition to a fossil-free world, and changing the way that we treat nature, working with rather than against nature so that we can have the food that we need and want, hopefully have some lovely wine as well, and a planet that can support it within what the planet can actually renew and thrive under. So basically a world where we all can lead good lives and the planet can also thrive and continue to be the place of beauty and wonder and spectacular wine, hopefully, that I've enjoyed, and leave that to future generations. So what I'm trying to do is link the science with feelings and action, as I told you. To sum up, let's see, now we're at a Swede. So I'm at Lund University in Sweden. So a Swede in 1896, quite a long time ago now, was the first to show that burning coal would heat up the planet. And he calculated through a very arduous hand calculation by hand. Of course, there were no computers then. It took him about a year, which he called his terrible year. And he made a very accurate estimate, actually, of, okay, if we burn this amount of coal, how much will it warm? That's about on track with what we've seen in observations and what the best models today predict. So good job, Svante Arrhenius. So we've had science for quite a long time. We have tens of thousands of peer-reviewed papers. We have, I think, the most rigorous and robust science that's out there is the IPCC. That's the UN, the United Nations Climate Panel. And those are scientists appointed by their governments to synthesize and make clear the science that's been published already. So they're not doing new research, but they're making a definitive agreement on what does science tell us, what do we know. And what that boils down to, you can read thousands of pages or hundreds of pages of the summaries, or 30 pages of the summary, or I'll give you what's now almost a haiku, which gets the key points. So that is, it's warming, it's us, we are sure, it's bad, we can fix it. That's what the science tells us. And I've seen that shift happen over the course of my career, where early on, starting in the 90s is when I was an undergrad, in the 2000s in grad school, there was a lot more focus on looking at trends. Is it in fact warming? Is this a real trend, or is it part of natural variability? Okay, it is warming. Is it warming due to human activities because it's warmed in the past before there were humans, so the Earth has natural mechanisms to change temperature? Which of these is responsible? Now we know it's definitively humans, primarily burning fossil fuels, that's causing the current warming. And we have just utmost certainty about that. So if you look back on the 6 rounds of reports that have come out from this group now, it goes from quite cautious wording in the 90s, which was where the science was then, the balance of evidence suggests a discernible human impact on the climate, to now the latest in the last year is, it is an unequivocal fact, humans are warming the climate. We just know that. And that statement has to go through peer review by scientists from around the world, and the summary where that statement comes from goes through line-by-line review of all of the world's governments and political appointees. So you can imagine that this process leads to quite conservative conclusions. So the fact that that statement made it in there is that it's just a fact that it's warming, it's us, we're sure. It's bad has become, again, much more clear and close to home for me and many of us through personal experience, and also through the data. I mean, we see, unfortunately, the terrible impacts of the climate crisis happening faster and closer to home and sooner and often worse than we might have expected or initially predicted. And that makes fixing it all the more urgent, because it's now really clear that, at one time, again, maybe back in the 90s, people would talk about costs and benefits or winners and losers. Oh, maybe, opening up Arctic shipping is going to offset the loss of lives and habitability for millions of people. No, it's actually not. So now that that balance is really overwhelmingly clear, that the impacts of climate change are overwhelmingly negative, the costs are really high, the costs of inaction are high, we would benefit from, and both economically and sort of existentially, from actually fixing the problem. So to fix it, we can start with stopping warming. And again, when I was in grad school, that was something scientists weren't entirely sure was entirely possible. So historically, the best understanding 20 plus years ago was that there was a lot of warming baked into the system. That even if somehow we completely stopped adding pollution to the atmosphere that was trapping more heat, we would experience a lot more warming for decades to come. And the good news is that that is now understood to be wrong. So in fact, the climate will stabilize, the temperature will stop increasing quite quickly, within a year plus minus of when the last molecule of carbon dioxide is emitted by human activities. So that's very good news. That means what we do really matters. And we have this narrow remaining window, what the IPCC calls this rapidly closing window to secure a livable future for all. That's the time that we happen to be alive. So here we are actually the most important people who have ever lived, because we're alive in this time where what we do makes such a critical difference. So how can we cope with this? How do we handle being in this predicament, which we certainly have inherited to a large degree? Maybe we've played a role in trying to help. Maybe we have not done as much as we could and we want to make that change happen. How do we cope with that? I think a lot of research now is supporting the need to really address emotions in climate action. And that's both because climate distress can really paralyze people and cause a lot of harm. So we see a mental health crisis in young people today. A big study that came out last year showed a lot of young people feel betrayed and angry at leaders for failing them. They feel like their leaders, people who've been in power, have not done what they should, have not lived up to their responsibility. And it's a really heavy burden. And I heard some of these same thoughts echoed by the young people who joined me before this talk tonight, that they feel like they don't want to hear from their parents or the older generations, oh, great, you all have so much energy. It's so great that you're doing so many good things. You're going to solve this problem for us. They want those of us who created the problem, those of us who are in power, to use our power to make the changes that are needed. And I think something that really blocks climate action is not being able to engage emotionally. Some research that I just wrote about last week in my newsletter found that overly engaging in a cognitive mode with the climate crisis can be a way of people rationalizing not engaging in action. And those can be defense mechanisms like, okay, I'm doing something that I know isn't great, but other people are doing worse. Or, I'm not as bad. Yeah, I took 5-10 flights last year, but look at Elon Musk, he took way more. And it's not to excuse others who have more power or more responsibility than we do. But I think we need to be able to handle climate emotions in order to meaningfully engage. So I talk about a framework for handling climate feelings in 5 stages. And it's not perfectly linear, but as a rough approximation, people have told me they find it helpful to kind of navigate this terrain. And those stages are ignorance, avoidance, doom, all the feels, and purpose. So we all started out in ignorance. None of us is born knowing about the causes and solutions of the climate crisis. We have to learn from somewhere, from teachers, from books, from conversations, the media, etc. In parallel, often with that ignorance getting chipped away at by information and learning we take in, often we see avoidance going up. And part of that can be because it's uncomfortable to take in information that feels overwhelming, perhaps threatening, seems to demand change from us that we're not sure what that would look like or if we're capable of. And it often feels more comfortable or safe to avoid the problem, avoid thinking about it, scroll past the bad news on our phones rather than engage. For many of us, there comes a moment where something breaks through and we feel it's less uncomfortable to actually engage than to continue to avoid. For me, I had a moment where I had to confront that I was, as at that time, a frequent flyer. I could no longer sort of live with the cognitive dissonance of knowing that I was in this small group of 1% of people on Earth who cause half of the climate pollution from flying, people who take more than a couple flights a year. There's not that many people who do that, and I was in that group. And I knew that, and I knew it was the biggest part of my personal emissions, but I couldn't figure out a way to change because I applied for 66 jobs. I got this one in Sweden. I moved here to Europe, and there's an ocean, which you may have noticed, between here and the US, which is where I'm from and where my family is. So I didn't see an alternative for continuing to see my family, which I wasn't willing to stop doing, and continuing to fly. And I think having this really black and white binary way of thinking about it, either I'm completely perfect and never fly again, but that means I'll never see my family, which I can't do, or at least as I was thinking of it at the time. Or, I just keep flying 10 times a year, which I did, or 15 times in 2010. That was my peak flying year. I just keep doing it and don't think about it because I can't see the way all the way to where I think I need to be, so I'm not even willing to get started. And what made me stop that avoiding was talking to my friend Charlie. So we were both at a conference in Vienna in 2012. Charlie had taken the train there from near London, and I had flown there from Copenhagen, near Lund. So about the same distance we had traveled. And I realized from talking to Charlie, he had decided to stop flying within Europe. And he said, it's doable. He was still having adventures, he was still traveling, he was still engaging with his work, making collaborations. He said he had deliberately decided to wind down research collaborations, in North America, for example, that would have expected or demanded more flying. So he used the leverage he had within his position to design a way of flying, needing to fly less. And he also chose in his free time, for example, to combine work and travel by train. So that's something, at that moment I decided, okay, that's something I can do. I can move from avoidance to taking this action. And that flight back from Vienna to Copenhagen was the last flight I've taken within Europe. So that was 11 years ago, 2012. Anyway, in the general progression of these 5 climate feelings, we have ignorance, avoidance. We have a moment of confronting avoidance. If we don't have some kind of supportive network, like I did in my case with Charlie, often the step after avoidance is doom. And I think a big reason that people get stuck in avoidance is they think doom is the end. Well, if I engage, if I allow all this bad news to come in, I don't see a way out. Everything's going to go to hell. I can't do anything about it. So no one wants to sign up for that. Doesn't sound like very much fun. And I think a lot of people, this is where you get down some black holes of the internet where, you don't find something that helps you sleep at night. So the way through doom, the good news is there is a way through doom. The bad news is requires going through all of the feels. So this is where all of these emotions and all of the complexities, it's not as simple as good or bad, yes, no, we can do it, we won't. It's where all of that exists in tension. So it's hopes and dreams and fears and concerns and community and creativity and solidarity. It's grief about the losses that have already happened. It's anger about injustices. And it's energy to come together in communities and start building towards change. And I think expanding what's called our window of tolerance, being able to exist in these uncomfortable emotions and allow them to be and have healthy practices for coping with them, gives us the power to get to the 5th stage, which is purpose. So purpose is where we can act from our deepest values, the things that we care about the most, that are the most important and cherished to us, and put them into practice in our actions. And aligning our actions and values feels really good. It feels much better than avoidance. It feels much better than doom. It coexists with all the feels, and there are certainly ups and downs, but in general, pointing at where you want to go and taking the steps towards that goal is what we need to be doing. I have a friend who describes his role professionally as, I want to be able to say, look back on my career and say, I showed up and I did my part. I think that's really helpful because many of us get too overwhelmed by the scale of the problem to even start. And of course it's true, no one is powerful enough to completely single-handedly solve the climate crisis. That's just not possible. But it's also true that we won't solve the climate crisis without each of us engaging. And when we do show up, when we do our part, we're helping build the momentum to enable others to go further and faster. We're putting pressure on businesses and government and policymakers and leaders to do their part. And we're taking responsibility for the pieces that we can do. So that's where I think we can align not just the ambition, where we're pointing, where we want to go, but with our actions of actually walking the path, of implementing the steps we need. So I'll take my last few minutes to talk about what those steps are. So now we've gone through facts and feelings, we're on to action. I like to talk about 5 climate superpowers for action. And these come from a study we published in 2021. It was actually used by Netflix in their Don't Look Up climate platform and by the IPCC as part of their work on how to basically actually meet the climate targets. So I think these 5 superpowers hold a lot of the key for how we can link personal and system change. What is it that we can do as individuals and help others to do that actually builds towards collective change? Those 5 roles are as consumers, investors, role models, professionals, and citizens. So I'll give you some highlights of what we could do with those, and then set you free for discussion. One thing I do want to say is, how are we going to make time for these things in our already busy lives? And I've started reflecting on this myself. Some of the latest time use studies find that many of us spend more than 10 hours a day consuming content. So we're watching or reading or listening to stuff without acting on it. And I'm all for learning and expanding our horizons and taking in new things. But I feel pretty comfortable in venturing that if we're spending 10 hours a day doing that, not 100%, it's not the case that 100% of that is serving us, benefiting us, giving us positive energy, expanding our worldview, making us think in new ways. We've all been stuck doom scrolling and realized, this isn't good for us, but I'm still doing it, for example. So I think it's really helpful to think about, do I have 20 minutes in my day? Today, for example, have I had 20 minutes where I used it in a way that actually wasn't very good for me? It wasn't truly relaxing or nourishing or rewarding. It didn't help restore my energy. It wasn't serving what I wanted. That's maybe 20 minutes you could start putting towards these high-impact climate actions. So, first, as a consumer, I want to say really clearly that 90% of the world does not need to reduce their carbon footprint. But most of us in this room probably do. And it's really important that we get this right, because often the discussion around consumption really focuses on the wrong areas. When we think consumption, we might think of physical things that we can touch and see, like clothing, for example. That turns out to be a really small part of the carbon footprint for individuals. The biggest sources that that goes under consumption comes from mobility. So for this top 10%, which is actually, again, people tend to think of, the global wealthy, these are billionaires, super elites, private jets. To be among the richest 10% of people on Earth, you need to make 35,000 euros a year. So most Europeans find themselves in this group or close to it. So it's helpful to kind of put this into context. For the 90% who are not making that much money, they basically don't generate much carbon pollution. And system change will be enough to make their lifestyles sustainable. But for those of us who, for example, ever been on a plane, which most people on Earth have not, we do need to look at our own footprint. So if you're in that group and the more money you have, statistically, the more polluting we are. If we're in that group, then the biggest thing you can do to reduce your footprint is reduce flying. For those of us who need to reduce the most, flying is about 40% on average of our carbon footprint. The second biggest is to reduce driving. For this top emitting group, driving is about 20% of our emissions. So together, those two things are more than half of your footprint. So that's why it's so important to focus on ways to reduce driving and flying as much as we can, both in our own lives, if we're in this group, and make it easier for others to do the same, changing workplace cultures and so on. The last thing there, the third high-impact climate action, is to eat a healthy and sustainable diet. So that is going without meat if you can. There is some room in a healthy and sustainable diet to include some animal products. That's about equivalent to 1 glass of milk or 1 piece of cheese the size of your thumb per day, a couple of servings per week of fish, egg, and chicken, about the size of a deck of cards, and a couple of servings per month, so 2 burgers per month. I know it's not a lot of cheese. I think that's what you're thinking. But working towards that makes a really big difference for the climate and for biodiversity, because animals use a lot of land, water, produce a lot of climate pollution. Okay, that's as a consumer. What about as a role model? There, we know from research that people are really affected by the behavior of others around them. And a major reason a lot of things are stuck on climate action is that people look around. Most people do know and care about the climate crisis. But they look around and say, I don't see other people around me acting like this is a crisis. It must not be that bad, or it must not be something I should be acting on. People like me don't take action. So we need to break that and show that people like us do take action, both by these lifestyle changes I've talked about that can find ways to enrich your life, to still have meaningful time with others and the things that you value at a much lower carbon footprint. I call that the low carbon high life. Thinking about what you put on social media, the kinds of messages you're reinforcing. Do you have a holiday card that is your extended family of 30 people on an exotic beach that you flew to very far away? Is that the kind of values you want to promote, for example? And really important is to convene climate conversations. And there, listening is the number one thing. There's great guides for how to do this more thoroughly. But in general, you don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to know all the right things to say. It's enough to start with, I'm really worried about, my daughter being evacuated from a wildfire in Greece, or I'm really worried about these headlines I'm reading, and let the conversation go from there. This is why I care about this, and open conversations to listen. As an investor, we can put our money into climate solutions instead of pollution. So that could look like breaking up with your mega bank. Unfortunately, most of the big banks are still building out fossil infrastructure. The science is really clear. We don't have any room to expand pipelines, mines, things that dig up and burn more fossil fuels are preventing us from reaching our climate goals. So banks that are giving industries money to continue to do that today, when so much time has gone by, so late in this game, I think don't deserve to have our money. And I don't want my money being lent out to others. So putting your money in a bank that's not doing that is a high impact action. Divesting your pension and investments if you have those. So looking at you can use I just wrote about this in my newsletter in detail, but in brief, you can look at the footprint of any stocks or funds or pensions you own and make sure that those are not supporting fossils and climate pollution. And if you can, donating time and money to groups that can leverage and work for system change can be really effective. Okay, what about as a professional? There, I think all jobs need to be climate jobs. So I'm not going to tell you have to quit your job if you have a job you like. Please stay in it because you're probably good at it and you probably have spent time and effort and training to get good at it. So please use those skills to make your job a climate job. Project Drawdown has really helpful guides on how to do that. If you're in human resources or procurement, or certainly if you're a policymaker, I have lots of specific ideas for what you can do. We can also look at industry, moving the whole industry. So within your company, changing the policies of your company, within industries, moving towards fossil-free and high standards. And then finally, as a citizen, this really resonates here in Brussels, the capital of European policymaking. I think it's really important not to take for granted that most people on Earth don't live in a democracy. And democracy only works if we keep it alive and if we use the rights and privileges that others have fought hard for us to have in a democracy. So the number one thing that affects climate policy is to vote. Studies have shown that voting for women and voting for candidates with strong climate scores measurably reduces emissions. So that is really important. Joining political groups or organizations that are working for political change, being part of larger organizations that can work on a strategic level is really important. Getting media attention has been shown to reduce emissions. The politicians really care what the media write about them and how they're represented, and it's important in the feedback loop of what they prioritize. So writing letters to the editor, trying to get news about positive actions that others can take too can be really high impact. A really underused citizen strategy that I think we should be doing much more is to call your representative. Like pick up the phone and actually call them. Studies have shown, and I've heard this today from some of the members of they're not voted, but members of the commission that I spoke with today are basically saying, we have, citizens don't tell us basically. We know, we have the facts. It's not that we don't know, but we don't hear the demands of citizens for strong climate action. So that can be an incredibly effective and underused strategy of actually saying, I'm someone who votes you into office. It's really important to me that you adopt strong climate policy. And the last one there is to participate in peaceful demonstrations. Those have been shown to move the needle on policy. So with that, I think I'll just wrap up for now and say I hope I've given you some food for thought on how to link those 5 facts from science of it's warming, it's us, we're sure, it's bad, we can fix it. Navigate those 5 stages of climate feelings from ignorance to avoidance to doom, and get through doom to all the feels and purpose. And within action, specific actions that you can take and translate to your spheres of influence as a consumer, investor, role model, professional, and citizen. So thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to the conversation.